feel well enough now to continue, Mrs. Gray?
Yes, my lord, I'm very sorry.
Mr. Lloyd?
Mrs. Gray, at the time when you were going to see Dr. Coe, why did you refuse to talk about your childhood?
I beg your pardon?
I said... Look, didn't you hear the question, Mrs. Gray?
I'm sorry,
I'm
I
asking
don't
you
think...
why, when you went to see Dr. Coe, you refused to talk about your childhood.
My childhood?
Yes.
Well, why should I talk about my childhood? To Dr. Coe or anyone else? There's too much of this prying into people's pasts these days. One's childhood is one's own business.
It was a period of considerable distress for you then, was it?
No, not at all. My childhood was a marvellous period. I was blissfully happy as a child.
Tell me about your family.
My family?
Yes.
What about them?
Well, anything you like. How many brothers and sisters? Your mother, your father?
Oh, there were only my sister and myself. My older sister, Dilys. My mother was a gentle, quiet woman whom I never knew very well. She died when I was only 8.
And your father?
Oh, my father was a wonderful man. He was conscientious and strong-minded, though I don't think my sister Dilys quite appreciated that.
What does that mean, Mrs. Gray?
Well, I'm not telling tales. Dilys was just a natural-born rebel, I'm afraid. See, my father didn't believe in higher education for women, but Dilys wanted to go to university after school. In the end, she did, in spite of all my father's objections.
Until you were married, did you always live with your father, or did he send you away at any time?
Send me away? Why should he send me away?
Well, who knows? To school, perhaps?
I always lived with him.
Thank you, Mrs. Gray.
Miss Tate?
Your father didn't approve of higher education for women.
No.
Did that affect you, Mrs. Gray? Did you yourself desire to take up higher education after school? Mrs. Gray, you must attend to what I'm saying and answer the questions. Were you capable at school? Were you good at your work?
Really, I don't know why you're going on about this. I've told you as much about my early life now as any reasonable person could expect to hear.
Miss Tate, Mrs. Gray has just expressed a thought that was uppermost in my own mind.
My lord, my friend has cross-examined my client about her childhood, and I feel that I am entitled to re-examine her on that topic.
Very well, Miss Tate, I must rely on your good sense to know when to stop.
Well, what happened next, Mrs. Gray? Did you take a job?
No. Various types of positions were suggested, but somehow nothing entirely suitable ever seemed to turn up.
Again, it was your father who made the decision?
That's ridiculous. There were all sorts of other considerations by now. In any case, with Dilys gone, my father was quite alone in our home. I began to see it as my duty to look after him.
And your father encouraged this point of view, no doubt?
He was a good man. He thought of me, not himself. He had a bad heart and was worried about what might happen. He said I should think of getting married.
Did you want to marry Mrs. Gray?
Well, I hadn't thought much about it. I was only 19. What concerned me more was, well, if my father were to die, say, what could I do? Where would I be then?
You're saying that you were utterly dependent upon your father, and that life without him seemed inconceivable? Now listen, Mrs. Gray, this is very important to your case. The court is being most indulgent in allowing me to question you in this way. I am trying to help you. Why did you marry Rick Gray?
He came to the house one night. It was something to do with some advertising his firm was arranging for my father, and Rick was the bright young man who was supposed to solve all the problems. It was evident my father liked him. It was evident Rick liked me. He came back often. My father made no objection when he asked to take me out.
Had there been any other young man in your life?
A couple, but my father did...
Your father didn't approve. So in the end it was your father who chose a husband for you, was it? And very soon you woke up with 2 children by a man you didn't even like very much, only respected and depended upon utterly, just as you'd respected and depended upon your father before him. Mrs. Gray, did you hate your husband as cordially as you'd hated your father?
I didn't hate my father. I loved him. My father was a fine man, but very stern. All my life he'd been strict. There was a cellar where I used to play from time to time. I was about 10, I think. It was a dark and cold place. I was in a black state after my mother died. Nobody knows what that's like for a child. I played a game in which I was surviving against odds in some barren, icy landscape. The Arctic, perhaps. The game involved little scraps of food, splinters of wood, because I used to light tiny fires to keep myself warm. One day my father came into the cellar while I was preparing one of these games. He saw the little fire I'd built, the matches, the remains of other fires. Suddenly he was monstrously angry. I didn't know anyone could be so angry. He said I was trying to destroy everything he'd built up in his whole life. He said I was trying to kill him. He punished me, then locked me up in my room for a day, while he said he was deciding whether I should stay with him or shouldn't be put somewhere else. Nothing I said made any difference. Then or later, he wasn't interested in me, only in my being a good little girl.
Mrs. Gray, was all this in your mind on June the 28th last, the day you set fire to your husband's house?
If only Rick had put the house in my name too when I asked him to. That would have shown he saw me as his equal at least. Not like my father. Not the same.
Very well, Mrs. Gray, you may return to the dock.
That concludes the case for the defense.
Mr. Lloyd?
Members of the jury, it is beyond doubt Fiona Gray has had a hard life. It is beyond doubt she was misunderstood as a child, and it is beyond doubt she is a neurotic woman who deserves our sympathy. But it is also beyond doubt that on the evening of June the 28th of last year, she set fire to and destroyed the house in which she lived, and setting fire to that house was arson, and that is a criminal act. As it is beyond doubt that she did set fire to the house, her only defence is that when she committed this criminal act, she was in a state of automatism and totally and utterly unaware of her actions. But I maintain that this defence does not stand for these reasons. Dr. Coe, called by the defence as an expert witness, has admitted that Mrs. Gray's actions on the night of June the 28th were not a direct result of her neurosis, and in fact did not remotely equate to the stresses on her. On the night of the fire, she plainly recognised and spoke to her neighbour, she plainly recognised and spoke to her husband, easily referring back to a conversation of earlier that morning. And whatever she meant by her strange remark, "They're not my children, Bobby, they're his," she was, by virtue of saying it, telling Mrs. Helder she was aware the children were in the house. And finally, if indeed she had been acting automatically on the night, why is it that her husband, her lover, and her neighbour do not believe her? Setting fire to the house was an act which she had consciously discussed before, and I believe it was consciously committed on the night of June the 28th. And I must ask you, regardless of any personal sympathy you may well have for Mrs. Gray, to fulfil your lawful obligations as jurors and, on the evidence, find Fiona Gray guilty as she is charged.
Members of the jury, I think it is very obvious to all in this court today that Fiona Gray is a sick woman in desperate need of help. She is also a woman very much alone. We've seen how her husband, her lover, and her neighbour have all given evidence against her, and we've heard that she's been separated from her children for several months now. Fiona Gray is a woman who did not receive the education to allow her to reach her full potential. All her life she has depended upon others, first her father and later her husband. But after the second child was born, then she ceased to be this quiet, submissive wife and suddenly began to want to establish herself as a person in her own right. Finally, when after confessing to her husband about the lover, he told her that he wanted a divorce, she completely went to pieces and acted the way she did. I put it to you, members of the jury, that Fiona Gray did not know what she was doing when she lit the fire in that garage. Her children were in the house as she saw the flames enveloping it. At this very moment, members of the jury, Mrs. Gray is keeping herself away from her children in fear that she might hurt them. Is that a woman who would have deliberately lit a fire in a house knowing her children to be in it? Dr. Coe told us that she is a sick woman in desperate need of help and asking for the help in the only way she knows how. I do not believe that she was responsible for what she did on the night of June the 28th, and consequently, I ask you to find her not guilty of the charge of arson.
Members of the jury, you have a difficult task before you. What you have now to decide, reduced to its simplest terms, is, did Mrs. Gray know what she was doing when she acted in that manner? Now, there is little doubt that Mrs. Gray is a neurotic and unhappy woman. But unhappiness and desperation do not constitute a compulsion. Men and women who find their personal problems unbearable do frequently and in full consciousness commit crimes. And though we may sympathize with their circumstances, this in no way justifies their behavior. Automatism, however, is a condition in which a person ceases to be responsible for his actions, and it follows, therefore, that he cannot subsequently be held responsible for those actions. Members of the jury, it is for you to decide, did Mrs. Fiona Gray know what she was doing when on June the 28th she set fire to and destroyed her husband's home in that close? We'll now retire and consider your verdict.
All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Just answer this question, yes or no. Have you reached a verdict upon which you are all agreed?
Yes.
Do you find the prisoner Fiona Gray guilty or not guilty of arson?
Guilty.
Is that the verdict of you all?
Yes.
Next week, you can join another jury when our cameras return to watch a leading case in the Crown Court.